Okay, we're right at 9, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm always excited with how many people show up for content strategy talks at a Drupal conference here. This is wonderful, and it just gets me really, really excited about this every year being here. So thank you all. I wanted to start by saying I'm Christine Leake. I'm a content strategy manager at ICF Next, and what I do is not only content strategy, but managing and training new content strategists. And I want to talk today about content modeling and all of the ways that it's made some of our projects better lately. That, and I have always wanted to start a talk off with this quote from Warren Ellis, which is, everyone thinks I'm going to talk about the digital world in the future, but what happens is I rant for an unspecified length of time. So I'm going to go not only into the what, how, why of content modeling, but also a little bit about the iterative process and growing pains that got us to where we are before we landed on modeling. And since it's in the name of the talk, I wanted to discuss very briefly what an ERD is, an entity relationship diagram. So these are flowcharts that show in a database how entities relate to one another. They have very specific symbol sets for one thing can relate to many can relate to many. It shows all of the authored pieces of content and the referenced content throughout. So they are documents of truth that need to represent exactly how the database is in a point in time. But as I started diving into those for an unrelated project, I went, why are we having the developers come up with this from scratch? Why aren't we starting with this? It's a beautiful map, and it really shows how the structure of your content needs to inform the structure of a site or an app or whatever it is that you're building your content around. So then what's a content model? Normally, content models start out collaboratively, and like any good UX project or any good design project, they start with Post-it notes. They can start sitting around a table, they can start in a collaborative whiteboarding tool like Mural or Real-Time Board, but they start with getting just general ideas and concepts mapped down, and then they can move into something that's more complex, like the lower example here, where you have your content types all documented out and all of the fields under them, and how you approach that and getting it right and making it collaborative from the start can really help pull your team together. And for those of you who may be on a team where you're still kind of finding your place and still kind of convincing them that content strategy needs to be in the room from the beginning, this can be a really good way to guide your participation in the discovery process. So why bother? Because migrations are hard. Has anyone gone through a migration that maybe wasn't as smooth as you anticipated that it would be? Yeah, the type of thing where you spend 30 minutes at someone's farewell happy hour just trying to forget, but also you can't stop talking about it because it's like group therapy because it was just that bad. Migrations can be like that when your content doesn't match up to the backend structure, when there's that mismatch. So something that's like, yeah, it's a scripted migration. It'll take us, one sprint. It'll be fine. And then suddenly you're going, oh no, we have to manually migrate every single one of these pages, and we're going to have to rewrite them. The thing that can make the migration a trial by fire is sometimes content decisions get made based on the forms or fields of a page late in the game. Sometimes rewrites are happening when everybody should be focused on preparing to launch, and you wind up kind of trying to mash square content into a round hole. And then this mysterious symbol appears all through Slack as the sprint goes on, and you get closer and closer to launch, and you're still having to make these content decisions. These kind of migrations are the things that make people burn out. They make people want to leave, maybe not even just the job, but the entire field. It's extremely frustrating, and I feel like 90% of my content strategy as a whole has to do with how do we make sure that this never happens again? How do we make sure that migrations can go more smoothly? And I feel like most people know this, especially working in government projects, but there's a desperate need for your content. So a lot of the times when you're making those decisions right at the last minute, you can feel like you're cutting something that you know people need or you know that your client wants, and when it works and when your content is really serving the people who it's meant to serve, we can do awesome things. I mean, we're standing in NIH. Anyone who's worked on HHS projects, it's very easy to talk about the value to your users and how amazing the project can be if it gets the right information to the right people. But if we're making content an afterthought, then those needs are not as easily met. So this is the rant portion. Finding 10,000 ways that won't work. As much as I would like to trust brainyquotes.net, I have a feeling this is not actually an Edison quote. Regardless, I won't go through all 10,000, but I want to go through a few of ways that we started trying to kind of make the process better. So for context, this was a project where we initially planned for the usual process and, lots of discovery time, as you often go into, projects with that kind of doe-eyed optimism, and then realized every 2 to 3 sprints we were going to be designing out something totally new and just adding on and adding on and adding on, and it was very reactive. And so each retrospective, each time we went through, we were going, okay, what's one thing that we can focus on making better and put all our hopes on this will help the content match the back end and it'll just work. So if we were mapping these to stages of grief, this might be denial. This was sort of the older way that we had done it, coming in, inventory, audit, usually a content strategy plan document that would be, 10, 15 pages that no one would ever read. We do a lot of writing, a document about the migration plan that no one would ever read. Then we'd migrate everything, usually manually, quality assurance testing, and then inevitably the scramble to get everything picture perfect as we launched. This was something where we know that there are pieces in this that are incredibly valuable. Inventories and audits, if you didn't catch the collaborating on audit session yesterday, definitely find the recording. Those are extremely valuable and necessary, so we knew we couldn't cut those, but we were like, where are some places where we can move away from these heavy narrative deliverables? If a document explaining how we're going to approach migration is not serving our needs, then where can we lighten the reading load that we're giving to developers and UXers? Because a lot of this was, well, I wrote it in the strategy plan, or I wrote it in the migration plan, and you just sort of lob it over the fence and go, there you go, homework for you, UX, I hope you like it. And there wouldn't be as much collaboration. So the other piece that we knew we needed to fix was getting everyone in the room. So the next iteration, we came in and we're like, okay, the inventory and audit spreadsheet, if we take that and make it into the migration plan, then we can kind of make everything perfect. It'll explain where everything goes, we'll map new to old, we'll have redirect plans, and those all helped, but it didn't solve the content structure because it was still looking at everything on a page size level. We had templates that were looking at the page, they weren't really looking at what content in the page drives these various pieces of the template. So this would be maybe not anger as a stage of grief, but frustration, because it was, there's a lot of, well, we have a spreadsheet for it, doesn't that, at least it helps, that sort of feeling. And then the next iteration, okay, clearly we need better specs. So I want to go on record as officially apologizing to any business analyst to whom I've said these words. It has to be absolutely foolproof, because there is no way to write truly completely foolproof specifications without communication. There's never going to be, it doesn't matter if it's Confluence, Zero Height, Notion, whatever you're using and however detailed you are, it's still a document that is going to be interpreted by the person that you're handing it off to. And that's another place where there can be a bit of a disconnect. So that's bargaining, and then this would be depression. Maybe if we wireframe out the back end, like literal pixel perfect wireframes of the authoring environment for content editors. Perhaps predictably, this thankfully was not a very long-lived experiment, but it got across the point of, okay, well, what's actually going wrong? The fields that we assume are going to be there as content editors, as content admins, were not matching what we were anticipating when we were creating the content. So anyway, quick recap. We have all of those different bits and pieces that are useful but not kind of a final perfect product. And one of the main things was that we were stuck looking at content in page-sized chunks. Not only that, we were looking at how the content was currently locked into page-sized chunks. That meant if all of the bios for everyone in an organization lived on a leadership page or an about us page or a staff page, then it would go into our inventory and it would go into our audit as this is the list of this is the staff page. There was no nuance to break it down and say, oh, okay, the staff, whether or not the staff page exists is irrelevant. What we need to look at is the fact that there are people, and these people have a name, they might have a degree, they have a bio, like there's things about them that we need to have and that we already have. And then how those get displayed, how those get fielded out, how those get built depends on the content that actually exists in there, instead of just saying it's one huge page. So enter the content model. This is it can be a very brief step, but it is very worthwhile to do before you dive in, which is researching the topic you're going to be building a thing for. You don't need to be a subject matter expert, and depending on how early you start the inventory, that can help you get up to speed, but you have to be familiar enough that when you start talking to subject matter experts and they start throwing out acronyms and jargon and all of these different things, you can keep up. Because a lot of times you find people, the most vocal people, who are willing to talk to you about what they wish, their huge wish list for the website and everything that has ever been wrong with it for the past 15 years, it tends to move pretty quickly because they tend to be very passionate people. And if you're doing a site about grants and there's, suddenly we're talking about funding vehicles and FOA and like all of these other terms, just having a passing familiarity with that can make a big difference in how that conversation goes. It also helps build trust, because then the experts you're talking to don't have to feel like they're slowing down for you. You don't have to risk them feeling like they're not going to be heard or understood. So next, get everyone in the room. This seems like a theme. It's almost like the theme this year is community. But this has definitely been a theme across the sessions that I've been to this week. Getting everybody talking, getting everyone in the room. This doesn't necessarily mean all in a physical room. It just means getting everybody's voice in and capturing, information and what's important to various people throughout the process. It also doesn't mean, well, we don't have anything to build yet, but let's start taking up 3 to 5 hours of the developers' week every week in meetings because they need to be at the table. So balancing who you need to be talking to in each session with making sure everyone's heard and everyone's in the loop is definitely something worthwhile. And to borrow Pim's phrase from yesterday, the idea of time travel, the process from the following steps can be really helpful if you're getting buy-in for the idea of content models from developers, from PMs, from things like that. Just walking them through the process of like, here's how this is going to go, and kind of giving them that future vision can also make a big difference to whether or not people see the value in it right off the bat. So the main thing that you're trying to distill down from these conversations is not necessarily the wish list of features, like, I wish there was a giant button that would let me email this page to my friend. That's not necessarily something that's a great idea. It's not something we want to promise to a stakeholder in the first week or so that we're working on this, but we need to hear them out about, like, why do you have a website? What is it trying to do? And one example that I had is people suffering from psychosis have a better chance of recovery if they can access treatment programs. The states that receive funding need to spend a certain allocation on programs for people with first episode psychosis, and we need to have information about the program as well as its location. And so that's like a big paragraph block. But the main thing that we're pulling out of that is nouns and verbs. We want to look at what are the things, how do they connect to one another. So you have people, you have treatment programs, you have the condition for first episode psychosis, you have states, you have funding. Like you can just, right now we're just throwing everything at the wall and figuring out how the pieces connect because you want to see the entire ecosystem. And this can be done in one-on-one, or it can be done in a workshop collaboratively, just getting kind of that statement, that purpose statement kind of narrowed down. And then you can do something like this. No, this is sentence diagramming. I don't know if any of you have to do this in school? Okay, it's not just me, where you actually break down, this is the subject, the predicate, the verb, the adverbs, all of it, and how it connects. Thankfully, we don't need to get this detailed. We're just looking nouns and verbs. So this is more our speed. Just to start, it could be you have an organization, and that's comprised of people, and maybe those people manage events. You can have a city, and the city has hotel spaces in it. Hotels have rooms. Like there's all of the different ways that the pieces can connect. And not all of this has to map to content on the website yet. That will come, but that's not where we're starting from. And so getting the sense of what else out there is step one. For this, I'm going to call nouns content entities. You can call them whatever works for your team. Content entity sounds a lot better than things, and it sounds a lot more specific and easier to understand than content types, since those have a different meaning in Drupal. Entities do too, hence content entities. And then eventually, as you start looking into the website, as you start realizing what do we have content for, what do we actually care about with these things, you can get to something where you have this type of breakdown, and you're looking at reports. There's the title to the report, short description that maybe gets used around the site, definitely gets used in SEO. It's connected because the author gets referenced, and authors can have lots of reports. It has body text to the report. It's probably got a lot of other things, probably taxonomy, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things you want to try and capture with your document, your model, is when there can be more than one connection. So an author having more than one report, an organization having more than one authors, capturing those so that okay, here's what we got. The other thing you want to do is make sure that each content entity, it's a one-to-one relationship with your content. Has anyone ever used merge contacts on your phone, where you have like John Smith, John J. Smith, J. Smith, and it goes, hey, maybe all of these are the same people. We can just kind of combine them. This can be really helpful for that. I had a project I was on where we had a list of something like 250 authors. And it was because the names were totally, different. They had, sometimes they had their degree in their name, like PhDs or any other postnominals. And so what this does is it lets you know, here's what the clean version of this content looks like. You want to make sure, that's why first name and last name on this example are separate. Things like that can help you keep things formatted consistently across the site. It lets you see where things don't line up, and getting that sort of structure clean before the migration can make a massive difference as to whether or not something can come over smoothly and maybe even be scripted, because you've got them all aligned. But we want to scale it back before we get here. So the first draft should say simple, and keep in mind, if something isn't going to drive any functionality, consider whether or not it necessarily needs fielded. I ran into a content type when I was doing an audit at one point that had something like 60 fields, and they were all on average about 30 characters of information. And it was because their authors there was a lack of trust and a breakdown in the content governance process. So instead of saying, okay, author, here's the requirements for your document, make sure you have all of this information included, maybe it's legally required, it just needs to be in the body, they were making sure it was fielded as a way that the page couldn't even be published if it didn't have every single one of these. But it then had no context, and it was just this long list of item value, item value, item value over, and it was extremely hard to scan and extremely hard to use. So for pages like that, having editorial guidance for content owners might be a good thing. But it depends on your team, and this is why it's so important to talk to people, because if that's not a hill to die on, for example. It's something that you can work with them and say, okay, if your workflow, your process, you need that, then you make sure you preserve it. And then we're back to spreadsheet heaven, where the inventory and audit come in. So now, instead of, like, there are a lot of good best practices you can audit against. You can, pull in a million different things, but in the end, this is letting you audit against your content model and say, okay, I didn't realize we have newsletters, we have news articles, and we have newsletters. Are those the same thing? And kind of looking at the structure and the back end of how are these structured now, and can they be made to be the same thing? So that's why it's important to extend your inventory to the back end as well. If you can look under the hood, find the content types that exist now, find what the fields are, there are often a lot of surprises. So quick story time of an example of going into the back end and finding all sorts of unusual things. There's always surprises, especially if you get a website that someone's been using since the 90s, and they all have unique quirks and how things have changed over time. This was an instance where we knew that there was a taxonomy system in place. We didn't realize that it had 3,000 terms, and only about 500 of them had ever been used. The rest, everyone was blocked from using, and they were all synonyms, and they were using it to record synonyms rather than using taxonomy governance documentation. And so, but beyond that, there was absolutely no child-parent structure. It was just a sea of these 500 in-use fields. And so that let us being able to dive into the back end early and find that and go, oh my goodness, the search filters can't work. Nothing that we have planned is going to be able to be powered by this taxonomy. It meant that we could go in and start card sorting early, start setting expectations with the client really early, that how we were going to iteratively improve it, because the other thing that they'd been doing is the taxonomy drove no part of the site whatsoever. It had no purpose, but they had been religiously tagging everything for 30 years. So really powerful if it were organized. But there's another thing, it is amazing because they had such a dedication to this system without ever seeing any return on it or anything powered by it. And so being able to come in and say, no, this is still good, you should definitely still keep doing this, but now you're going to be able to have this new, really powerful filter faceted search because of these, was a really big project win. And this goes back to as you're auditing, compare, merge, find gaps. These are the places where you've done your audit, you get to the end, and you realize there are concepts in places that were on your original map, but no content exists for. And what our job then as strategists to do is weigh the consequences of filling those gaps versus not. Is this something where if we don't have content to address these gaps, the site will not work? Or is it something that it'll just be better, or it would be more useful if these gaps were filled? So that can build a lot of trust with clients as well, because if you give them an option and you're like, this would make it better, but it's not absolutely necessary, then when you come in and say, but this piece is actually necessary, they're going to be more inclined to trust you because you haven't come in saying everything is absolutely, top priority. You have to do absolutely everything or it's going to completely break and your site will light on fire and all of these things. It helps us establish that we're not being hyperbolic about the things we're recommending. And once you've got your initial model, everybody who's been either reviewing or involved in building it over time, it gives you a shared map to move forward with. So I used a ton of stock images, and this one was very, very close to being a pirate map covered in fake blood and doubloons. I just have to say, Pixabay is amazing. But to get back on topic, this sitemap and every other piece from here on out becomes so much easier with this map. Doing wireframes, writing specifications. If you already know, here's the fields, here's where you can pull from other content types, those things, instead of just being like, here's a Word document that I may or may not have actually used headings on, and here, design something for that, make a wireframe. It helps the communication between those groups and between the people working in those areas go a lot more smoothly. And so a quick example of how it improves site mapping. We had a project with probably 10 years of publications, and they were required to keep all of them online. So it was, the usual recommendation of going, well, they're older than 2 years, maybe you should think about pitching them, was off the table. But the way that they were organized in the existing site required users to first know the data source by which any data point in the publication had been obtained. So like what survey, what data set, they had to know that first. Then they had to know what the actual file, what the actual report type was. They had to know, is this an annual report? Is this a short report? Is this a spotlight? Without any context anywhere for what the differences between those were. And then they had to know what year the data had been pulled from, in that order. So you had to, basically, if you were not coming in via search engine, which was still pretty iffy because almost everything, the title was always the same except for the years, if you didn't know exactly how to make the beeline to where you needed to be, and you would probably need to know what state or whether you were looking for all state data versus national data. It was a powerful amount of data and a powerful amount of information and very needed content, but without any way to find the exact report that you thought you might be looking for, everything was lost. So we had the content model, we knew the content types we were going to build. We went, what if everything's a report? What if we use, taxonomy to explain all of these other facets instead of putting them in these artificial, behind artificial doors on your website in various pages, in various accordions, in various kind of hidey holes throughout the site. And because they could see kind of where we were going and how it was going to interact and what it meant for the structure of the site already, that was a much easier sell than if we had just come in and been like, hey, everybody who works in different divisions, we're going to throw all your reports in a big bucket. How do you like that? So a lot of it is just having that piece to refer back to. And over time, your model should change and grow. So those content entities, those can expand to include additional fields. As you find that things aren't valuable, you can take them out. You can align them to specs. If you have a pattern library, this is great because you just organize it by, organizing a pattern library is never a just anything. But it can be aligned to the content model. And it also lets you select where you're going to iteratively improve. For the example with reports, we knew those had to be improved before anything else. So ahead of the migration, it was all about getting that content cleaned up, getting it fielded correctly, getting that prepared. And then the other thing that the content model can let you do is expand beyond web content. So on another site, they had facts, basically, little facts that informed a sidebar, and they could be used in line, so they were using them kind of throughout the site. But when we realized, okay, you have these beautiful pieces of bite-sized content, image, title, tweet length, bit of text, what if, and they were in the process of building a chatbot, what if we did an API so that instead of having to hoard all of these facts in 2 different management systems for your chatbot and your website, we just let them talk to each other? And if we hadn't been able to see kind of the entire map of the content, that would have been a much more difficult conclusion to reach. And so the other thing that it improves is that there's less the stages of grief going on between sprints. And so I guess this would be acceptance. But it really does help get everybody on the same page. And I've seen projects where you have those very, very tense stand-up calls transform to like one of the better projects that people are trying to work on and actively asking to work on. It also, I've noticed, has spread outside of our team, outside of our lab. I'll get information, people requesting content modeling from all over the place. So like, as it's taken off, it's really kind of snowballed and gained a lot of momentum across our teams. And last but not least, I do want to go over and say, if you want to know more about this, the best resource I can recommend to you is Carrie Hayden and Mike Atherton's book, Designing Connected Content. And then I've got my contact information. And we have about 15 minutes for questions. Okay. Yeah, oh, absolutely. I missed that people were snapping pictures. And I don't get a cut of the Amazon proceeds for Carrie's book, so. And I have to give credit, Carrie came in and consulted with our teams as we were getting set up with content modeling, and so it's been really fantastic having her help us out and getting kind of our process down. Okay, other questions?
Have you done a Drupal 7.8 migration with kind of restarting your content structure?
I have.
Is that what?
Yes.
Okay.
That is a perfect time to do this,
Yeah.
because you're going to be migrating anyway, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing front-end changes. Content modeling and getting all the fielding, you can do that and have the site look identical before and after. So I know there were questions yesterday, I believe, about when do you audit, when do you inventory, things like that. That is absolutely a perfect time to do something like this. Sure.
So we're getting ready for D78 for a platform of 60 websites. So we've got content types for the state of North Carolina that for all of our agencies. So we've got press releases, we've got data table, we've got site page, which is the workforce page. So much unstructured content. So how do you take, how do you create a migration that recognizes, where those addresses are, where all these various content editors have put addresses or someone's title or
So you're looking through unstructured content across 60 sites for a string of characters that matches an address or like a phone number? Or any string of content?
To create an entity for address, then how do you find those addresses?
How do you find it everywhere throughout? There are some content tools that will highlight duplicate content across sites. You might be able to do that if it's the same address you're looking for. If it's different addresses, then it may be something where if you work with the site owners to get them to begin to do the revisions to the content structure early before the migration. I'm working on a similar project right now. We're just getting started on that. And so most of it has been expectation setting and being like, here's the things we'll improve after or as we migrate, and here's the things that'll make that process go more smoothly. And so a lot of it, I wish I could say there's like a magic bullet and there's absolutely something that will just find it and do it for you. And there may be, if it's really like, if it's structured and you can work with developers to be like, hey, is there a way for you to find a string that matches this everywhere in the site content? But it's probably going to be working with the individual sites one piece at a time. But it also does help having not only a content model that you're going to use for the final site when they're all together, but kind of the entire ecosystem. So something that comes out and maps how all of these sites relate to one another first. Because then you might, if it's different departments, this may not be relevant. There are oftentimes you can find like, oh, these two microsites were made like 4 years apart, but they actually do the same thing. And so there may be places you can kind of consolidate so your migration gets a little smaller. Any others? All right. Oh, one more.
This may be a little bit basic or site buildery than this strategy discussion, but one thing that's always, I don't work in Drupal for a living, but I work for a nonprofit and I use it a little bit on some projects. But you mentioned taxonomy, and I wonder if you could just comment on sort of best practices on when you use taxonomy versus just using a field on to accomplish the goals you've set.
Absolutely. So question is taxonomy versus fielded information. When do you use each?
I tend to use more fields than taxonomies.
Right, and it in part depends what you're doing. So answer is twofold. The first is, what are you doing with it? If it's fielded out because it needs to display in a particular way on a page, like it's going to go in a sidebar or something like that, then fielding might be appropriate. But more than that, I would say it depends on how many different answers you can have to that field. So if you have a field and it's always going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like if you could envision a drop down when you're editing and say, okay, this is one of these, 5 values. And it can be a lot more complex than that, obviously, but if you're reusing those same values over and over and over across all of your content, then I'd usually lean towards taxonomy because you want to make sure that those are identical throughout. If it's something where, like a dollar amount for a grant, that's going to be different on every single one, then fielded is going to be more appropriate. But functionality is really what it comes back to. Are you going to filter by it? Are you going to make, is there, if it's a news article and you want to tag it as this is news, blog, or video or something like that, and you have a little flag, and that visual element is driven by that tag, then I would do taxonomy.
Another question. Does the designing connected content book have examples of like spreadsheets, migration spreadsheets?
It has examples of the content modeling.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, does Carrie's book have examples of the migration spreadsheets? I know it has lots of examples of the process. I don't know that it has the exact spreadsheet broken down because I feel like everyone has their own unique house sauce basically for how those get made. But I have done trainings on that and I've done talks on that. So if you want to reach out to me, we can talk examples.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you folks very, very much for showing up to the early session on Friday.